the second colonial wave in Africa. After gaining flag independence, prominent scholars, the Pan-Africanist leaders, national leaders, opposition figures, and think tanks warned about the dangers to true African independence stemming from the unliberated conditions of African economies, which were largely dominated by the former colonizers. Africa had only attained political independence, but not economic independence. Given the overarching influence of the former colonial powers and other developed nations of the world in all spheres of African economic life, Kwame Nkrumah, who became leader of newly independent Ghana in year 1957, expounded his ideas in his book called Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. The book was published in 1965 and it's worth reading. With the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union in late 90s, the formation of WTO in 1995, and an increase in expansion of the global economy, different actors competed for spheres of influence in the new economic world order. This led to the increasing presence and economic influence of China in Africa. Today, China is working on for strategic hegemonic interests. The exponential rate of Chinese political and economic activities in the continent of Africa have given birth to various terms such as neo-colonialism, new scramble, etc. Though I believe that the West is also culpable in Africa's neo-colonial rhetoric, but prevailing Chinese incursions into Africa's socio-politico-economic terrain are a form of, or indeed a new variant of colonialism. The intersection between post-Cold War liberalization and Chinese globalization acts within the complex web of hegemonic manipulation and neo-colonial relationship in Africa. There is a real risk that China will take advantage of the circumstances to transfer the current so-called win-win partnership into a long-term imperial project. And sadly, all of this is done under the titles of currents of globalization. The Chinese expansion and the intensification of economic activities in Africa resemble those that underpinned European imperialist motivations of the past centuries. Chinese actions are being blustered by its growing political influence with the continent's leaders due to its economic and financial potencies. China's interests in Africa, as were those of others before them, are built around the demand for new sources of energy and natural resources, which they need to fuel their industrial machinery. A trade worth less than $4 billion in 1995 amounted to nearly $10 billion in 2000. Since 2009, China has been Africa's largest trading partner, surpassing the United States. Mineral products, mainly the crude oil, accounted in year 2010 for 79.6% of China's imports from Africa. It was followed by metals, 10%, stone and glasses, around 4%, wood and wood products, around 2%. In 2011, China traded with Africa at 166 billion US dollar. Bilateral trade with Africa also surpassed the mark of 200 billion US dollar threshold from 198 billion in 2012 to 210 billion in 2013. Over time, more than 2,000 Chinese companies have invested in Africa, consistent with China's natural resource demands and Africa's infrastructure needs. Most of this investment has gone into energy, mining, construction, and manufacturing. For example, in 2010, Ethiopia alone had more than 580 registered Chinese companies with more than 2.2 billion US dollar in operation. The National Petroleum Corporation of China invested around 6 billion in the oil sector of Sudan. Additionally, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China acquired 20% of the Standard Bank of South Africa for 5.5 billion US dollar. Nigeria, South Africa, Sudan, Algeria, Zambia once accounted for more than 70% of China's FDI, the foreign direct investment. Tariff exemptions on certain goods from Africa have also been instituted by the Chinese government to promote trade ties with the African countries. Apart from natural resources, China finds that new and emerging economies in Africa provide needed markets for Chinese finished goods. China's main exports to Africa includes machinery, electronics, textiles, high-tech products, automobile tires, automobile spare parts, stationery, furniture, computer hardware, cosmetics, and other finished goods. While this somewhat two-way flow is significant for both sides in economic terms, but Chinese get more due to their industrial capabilities. Basically, Chinese involvement in Africa consists of imbalances in the trade relationships in favor of China. The investments by Beijing have a much broader approach than what is popularly known. The current situation is of a new scramble for Africa, and that means that Chinese investments could be as dangerous as the West has been. China and its engagement is nothing but naked imperialism, which includes the scramble for economic and political influence, coupled by the reality that many African governments depend highly on the concessionary sale of natural resources to generate necessary revenues to fund their internal development programs. China is using its massive financial resources to provide loans to Chinese companies to invest in Africa. Though through the People's Bank of China, the China Development Bank, and the Export-Import Bank of China, China continues to embolden its political influence and economic importance to Africa by supporting significant investments in infrastructure development. The single most auspicious mark of China's influence in Africa is embodied in the Chinese constructed African Union, the AU's headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, at a whopping cost of 200 million US dollar. dubbed as China's gift to Africa. China has made great inroads in Africa because of certain circumstances prevalent in that continent. Many African countries are plagued by bad governance. There are no rigid financial controls. Consequently, the living standards are some of the lowest in the world, and governments can hardly provide basic health delivery care and other social welfare services. Now, these circumstances are serious enough to immediately capture the attention of anyone wanting to partner with African governments. Unlike the World Bank or International Monetary Fund and Western governments that are known for requiring African governments to go through many exhaustive prescriptions, some of which border on internal governance issues such as fighting corruption, reforming the civil services, protecting freedom of speech and that of press, and others as well, as preconditions for financial grants, loans, and developmental assistance. The Chinese, in their outreach to Africa, has used a much different approach. The Chinese say that they have a policy of non-interference in others' domestic affairs. They also have a policy of no strings attached. These policy statements are part of what China's terms its win-win cooperation with the developing countries. In essence, what this means is that Chinese do not care about the domestic situation of the people in the African countries as long as they do not amount to threats to their business interest or business representatives. So the African governments must question the Chinese labor practices and treatment of African workers. Additionally, when a Chinese company, for example, secures a contract with an African government to build a road or anything, most of the engineers, managers, and other workers that are better paid are flown in from China. This creates a situation wherein little, if any, knowledge at all is transferred to Africans to capacitate them. But criticism of these sorts are hardly, if ever, made by an African government. They do come mostly from the Western media through investigative journalism. And to counter this, China has over the past few years invested heavily into its media influence and public diplomacy in Africa through mergers and acquisitions. Chinese media companies have established a critical voice and presence in the African media. In South Africa, Chinese media institutions have made a critical investment. China's influence in the media of Africa will encourage the system for a top to bottom control. The Chinese CCTV has its Africa office in Kenya, from where it deploys reporters to cover the continent. Cable TV viewers can also access CNC World, which is a part of which is the English channel controlled by Xinhua, the mouthpiece of Chinese Communist Party. Chinese government has also upscaled its investment in public and cultural diplomacy. More infamous Confucius institutes are being built, and Chinese festivals are celebrated across the continent, especially the Chinese Lunar Year. The Chinese are using their cable news platform to tell stories about some African leaders and their countries, the merits of which would be questionable if reported by any of the Western media. For African leaders, Chinese media presence is important for their image as it provides them alternative means of airing their views to the world without having to answer the hard and perhaps brutally honest questions that they may have to grapple with when dealing with the Western media. Public sector corruption has prevented money gained from concessions with Chinese firms from meaningfully impacting the lives of the common poor African people. Being Africa's largest trading partner, one would think that China should use its position to exert some considerable influence over African countries in issue of governance and accountability. But on account of or on name of non-interference, Chinese government continues to demonstrate no moral rectitude by not getting involved in the broader issues of good governance, anti-corruption and other things. Having suffered colonialism at the hands of Europeans in the past and still having to face many challenges left in its wake, such as poverty, dependency, unfair terms of trade, among others. Any investment by any outsider, especially one as powerful as China, and Chinese policy of debt trap diplomacy raises suspicions. Though China tries to put herself in the basket along with African countries as underdogs who have experienced similar form of imperialism and capitalist exploitation, the Chinese today are some of the biggest capitalists. If African nations fail to demonstrate improvement in governance and build strong institutions, China could and I think will exploit these vulnerabilities to keep political leaders on its side despite public skepticism against it. Now let's talk about the Chinese debt trap diplomacy. Here, China intentionally extends excessive credit to a debtor country, thereby inducing the debtor into a debt trap. This is done with the intention of extracting economic or political concessions from the debtor country when it becomes unable to honor its debt. The conditions of the loans are often not made public, and the borrowed money commonly pays contractors from the creditor country. In this case, it is China. Although the term has been applied to the leading practices of many countries, it is, as in 2020, most commonly associated with the People's Republic of China, where debt trap diplomacy is a part of Chinese diplomacy in which poor countries are overwhelmed with unsustainable loans and would be forced to cede control of their strategic assets to China. The infamous Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, a multi-billion-dollar expansion project of China to expand its power through lending to countries to spur their economic growth, is also an example of the same diplomacy. In total, the Chinese have loaned 143 billion US dollar to African governments and state-owned enterprises between 2000 and 2017. As of 2020, the countries in Africa with the largest Chinese debt are Angola, $25 billion, Ethiopia, 13.5 billion, Zambia, 7.4 billion, Congo, 7.3 billion, Sudan, 6.4 billion. Overall, 67% of African governments' external debt is owed to China. The Chinese loans are prone to misuse and have promoted the levels of corruption and fights for power in African countries. Now let's talk about some specific countries. The cases of some countries which are important are in debt trap of China. Kenya. Chinese debt account for 72% of Kenya's foreign debt. In late December 2018, Kenya reportedly came close to default on Chinese loans to develop its largest and most lucrative port, the port of Mombasa. If defaulted, Kenya might have been forced to give its control of its port to China. Kenyan media has debated whether Chinese loans are worth of risk, drawing analogies with the experience of Sri Lanka. Some commentators have said that these loans could jeopardize Kenyan sovereignty. South Africa. South Africa is estimated to owe the equivalent of 4% of its annual GDP to China. South Africa has received multiple tranches of Chinese loans, some of which have raised concern around their opacity and the conditions and alleged link with corruption in South Africa. This include a controversial 2.5 billion US dollar loan from the Chinese Development Bank to state-owned South African electricity utility Eskom that was arranged during the regime of Jacob Zuma. The conditions of the loan were not made public. An additional 25.8 billion US dollar loan from the China Development Bank during presidency of Cyril Ramaphosa was given to promote a 2018 economic stimulus package. The South African government initially described the loan as a gift. The details of the loan were not made public, causing significant public controversy. The government justified the loan by stating that the interest rate was not exorbitant and that it could not be disclosed due to confidentiality clauses. The loan was criticized by the opposition Democratic Alliance political party for possibly pushing the country into a debt trap. Nigeria. $3.1 billion of the country's total 27.6 billion US dollar foreign debt is owned by China. Nigerian financial publication Near Metrics warned of falling into the Chinese debt trap, given Nigeria's notable problems with corruption. Zambia. $7.4 billion of the country's total $8.7 billion of debt is owned by China, a large debt burden given the small relative size of Zambian economy. In 2018, Zambian lawmakers debated whether Chinese loans put Zambian sovereignty at the risk. The Zambian government was in talks with China about its total surrender of the state electricity company ZESCO as debt repayment, having defaulted on multiple Chinese loans for infrastructure projects. Djibouti, we all know Djibouti hosts a large number of military bases for different countries, but Chinese loans totals 77% of country's total debt. Djibouti owns over 80% of its GDP to China and in 2017 became host to China's first overseas military base. Republic of Congo. An estimated 2.5 billion is owned to Chinese lenders. The exact number is unknown even to the Congolese government. Egypt. an important ally of United States. China is financing the country's new capital, New Cairo. In an interview, General Ahmad Abidine, who heads the Egyptian state-owned enterprise overseeing the new capital project, criticized American reluctance to invest in Egypt. He said, "Stop talking to us about human rights. Come and do business with us." The Chinese are coming. They are seeking win-win situations. Welcome to the Chinese. And this was reported in New York Times on 25th November 2018. And one should not forget that Egypt controls the strategic Suez Canal. The BRI, China lists 39 out of 54 African countries on the Belt and Road official website, ranging geographically from Tunisia to South Africa. Welcome to the age of Chinese colonialism of Africa. It's time to wake up, guys. It's time for the world to wake up.